Welcome to Jennifer Klein, author of the Global Education Guidebook. And thanks so much for coming to chat to us today about global education.
It's my pleasure.
Well, let's start off with talking about what is global education, because there are lots of definitions and books and resources out there that talk about it. What does it mean?
Well, from my perspective, I think that global education is a lot of different things. I like to think of our world as having sort of concentric circles of encounter. And actually, this is connected to a visual that I provided to Meg in my last blog, which you guys printed as well. I see it as kind of an accordion, meaning that we can go the most global and we can go the most local, but it should all be interconnected. For me, global education isn't just what's the farthest place we can connect with, what's the most exotic culture we can get to know. It's about starting to understand the interdependence of our global connections, our national connections, our local connections as well, and really helping young people grow up with a deep sense of curiosity about and respect for the experiences that other people have, whether it's my neighbor down the block or someone inside my home, or whether that's somebody who lives on the other side of the world.
Well, you talked about when you sort of started to work in education and what global education was sort of like then. How has it changed over the years and the years that you've been working in the field?
Well, it's changed a lot, and I don't want to age myself or anything like that, or date myself, I guess is the phrase, or anything like that. But obviously, when we were doing global education, when I was in junior in high school, we were sending letters. We were physically traveling places. We were making connections with a great deal of time and labor involved. And so I think the biggest thing is that we have this incredible opportunity all over the world now, because of technology, to make connections much more easily. I think that's one of the biggest pieces. The other piece that I think, and this is what I really wanted to contribute myself to the conversation as well with the Global Education Guidebook, is that I see an increase over the last, say, 5 years in an interest in making sure that our global educational experiences are equitable, meaning that we are more and more conscious of how dangerous some of the colonialist frameworks are. And 20, 30 years ago, it wasn't uncommon for, and I'm not against service learning, I'd like to be very clear, but service learning programs where students came back feeling that they had somehow saved the community that they traveled to, that I'm not a big fan of, right? So I think that's a piece that started to shift a little bit. People are a little more aware of the importance of learning from and with, and of not seeing one culture as superior or one group as capable of saving another. I think that's the core of what the change that I'd like to see continue in global education is that, and our ability too to connect it to some of the issues of today, and really, we just did a Twitter chat on this question of the intersections with anti-racism. And I really think that work that's focused on every student's belonging and every human's importance in the fabric of our communities is a good thing. So I think that more and more global is offering us ways to have those conversations.
Oh, fabulous. And so many sort of opportunities and outcomes that can come from it. I mean, you've touched on some of those already, but what do you sort of believe, all the way right down from our preppies right up to high school? What are those outcomes that we can see and we can experience for our students and with ourselves as educators?
Well, it's funny. I've looked at this question in the miniature and in the big picture because of some of the testimonials I did for the book. So I know that in the big picture we have the potential to change lives. We have the potential to help students find pathways in their own lives that are going to benefit not just them but others as well. And I think that's the most exciting, is when I talk to a former student who's doing something super exciting, and I can hear the impact of her his or her global experiences in the core of who they've become. On a more concrete, sort of smaller scale, we're talking about global competencies, right? All of the things that we would describe, that a lot of people would describe as soft skills. I prefer not to use that word. I really think that these are essential survival skills for our time. These are things like creativity and collaboration and critical thinking. And when you put all of those kinds of skills into the global or intercultural context, I think they become all the more important, right? Because more and more our lives and our students' lives are going to be interconnected. They're going to be, in fields that are increasingly global every day. So it's not just how well do I collaborate with the kid sitting next to me. It's also how well can I collaborate with somebody who thinks differently than I do, and might even have a completely different set of priorities, right? So I think that's a big piece of it. I think it's about, we hear the word tolerance tossed around a lot still in the United States. And I think tolerance is a first outcome, a first step, learning to tolerate others. But tolerate is also a really low standard to work toward, because to tolerate someone means that I don't like you at all, but I've
Yes.
figured out how to put up with you. And I
Yeah.
would rather strive for something more like understanding and
Mm.
acceptance of the things that make us different and the ways that we think differently. Still with some critical thinking, obviously, about the practices that we might not think are humane or moral that are done in other cultures. It's a tricky line. Obviously, the critical thinking piece can be very tricky. But I think too, it has the potential to create, as I believe I referenced at the beginning, that bigger sense of community, that bigger sense of belonging. I mean, I grew up understanding that if my neighbor wasn't okay, then I couldn't say that I was okay, right? The values that I was raised with had to do with very, very clearly with understanding the needs and experiences of others. And I think that kind of exposure, especially when they're young, I just think it's really urgent right now. All over the world, there are these incredible opportunities to build belonging, to really build what Martin Luther King envisioned of a beloved community where everyone knows that they have a place at the table, and we just make the table bigger every time we need to. That's how I see the outcomes of global education.
Well, I mean, we also are in this sort of very unique period of time, aren't we, with the COVID-19 situation? And, you've touched on this idea that if the needs of others are sort of not okay, then, how am I okay? So, how has, COVID-19 impacted um, global education from your perspective? What have you observed or heard?
Well, I think there is a good side and a bad side. So I'll start with the good. I think that the good has been that the world is now filled with educators who have learned how to use technology tools, and who have figured out how, in most cases, how to engage kids effectively using those tools. So I think that's a huge change. I mean, even 5 years ago, I was teaching teachers how to use platforms like Zoom that are now, pretty much like grabbing the phone for most people.
Mm.
So I think that's a huge positive outcome, and it means that more and more connections are possible. On the other hand, though, and of course, we also have this common threat, right? So we've got this increased feeling of connectivity because we're all going through it, even if we're going through it in different ways. And I think that's actually a positive as well. On the negative side, I think there's been I see teachers feeling really overwhelmed. I
Mm.
see teachers navigating the hybrid environment. They've had to use that very, very popular word now. They've had to pivot
Pivot.
over and over and over again over the last year, and a little more than a year in some parts of the world. And I think they're exhausted. And so I think when that happens, our learning and our creativity are impacted
Mm.
as educators. And it makes perfect sense to me. I'm certainly not teacher blaming in the slightest,
No.
because if
Mm.
I don't even know if I'm going to engage my kids tomorrow online or in person because districts are making decisions constantly, then of course, it's going to be hard for me to continue my own learning. It's going to be harder for me to have the time or the bandwidth in a non-literal sense to really make the connections and do deep work around global education. So that's my biggest fear. My sense is that teachers are a little paralyzed still, although they're starting to come out of that paralysis, and that makes it tricky to
Mm.
ask them to do anything more. And in a lot of schools, global is perceived as extra or more, and that makes it even harder.
Yeah, and I mean that's something we've certainly um, observed at Meg, being a technology company, is that mass upskill of digital technologies, is that
Yes.
everybody's so much more confident and comfortable with using those now, from principals right down to our students, and of
Yes.
course our parents, because our parents have been our home learning.
Absolutely. And everybody's been teaching in a fishbowl. And yeah, I mean, I had teachers who were calling me sobbing daily because they couldn't find the right link, or they thought they were at the right link and then something went wrong, or a mom was leaning over a student, making comments to the teacher from the background, or, I mean, it was tough. Those first months, I was in Columbia running a school at the time that the pandemic hit. And those first months, and still in a lot of places, it's been very, very challenging.
Well, we will leave it here for part 1, and we look forward to part 2, where we find out more about global partnerships.